The phone rang at 7:40 in the morning, and the voice on the other end belonged to a woman who had been buried 6 days earlier. Daniel Ushworth would remember that exact time for the rest of his life, because it was the moment the world he thought he understood quietly came apart at the seams. He hadn't picked up. He'd been asleep, exhausted from grief, from funeral arrangements, from signing papers that made his sister's death feel official in a way his heart still refused to accept. When he woke the next morning and saw the missed call, he almost didn't check the voicemail at all. The number was unfamiliar, a string of digits with no name attached, and in the fog of early morning he assumed it was spam, another robocall about a car warranty he didn't own. Then he saw the transcription preview beneath the notification, 3 words auto-generated by his phone, and his entire body went cold. "Danny, it's me." He sat up so fast the room spun. His hands were shaking before he even understood why. He knew that phrase. He had heard it 1,000 times over 31 years of life, in kitchens and car rides and long late-night phone calls when neither of them could sleep. It was how his older sister Cla always began, every single time, like a signature only the two of them shared. "Danny, it's me. Not hello, not hey. Just those 3 words, worn smooth from a lifetime of use." Cla Ushworth had died 8 days earlier in what the county coroner's office had ruled a single-vehicle accident on a rain-slicked stretch of Route 9 outside their hometown of Marlborough, Vermont. She had been 34 years old. She left behind a husband, a 6-year-old daughter, and a brother who had spent every day since her funeral wondering how a person so full of noise and light could simply cease to exist. And now, according to the timestamp glowing on his phone screen, she had called him 4 days after she was lowered into the ground. Daniel didn't move for a long time. He simply stared at the screen, at the voicemail icon pulsing gently like it was daring him to listen. Outside his apartment window, Marlborough was waking up in its usual unremarkable way, delivery trucks groaning down Main Street, the diner 2 blocks over flipping its sign to open, the kind of small New England town where nothing ever happened and everyone knew everyone's business before breakfast. But inside that apartment, something impossible was waiting to be heard. He pressed play. For 3 full seconds there was only static, the hollow crackle of a bad connection, the sound recordings make when they've traveled somewhere they shouldn't. And then her voice arrived, unmistakably hers, warm and a little breathless the way she always sounded when she was walking and talking at the same time. "Danny, it's me. I need you to listen carefully, okay? I don't have much time. There's something you need to know about the accident, something I should have told you before, and I'm scared that if I don't say it now, I'm never going to get the chance." The message cut off there, 11 seconds long, that was all. Daniel played it 4 more times before he called his brother-in-law, and each time the hair on his arms stood a little strutta, because there was no mistaking the voice, no mistaking the cadence, no mistaking the small nervous laugh she gave halfway through the sentence, the one she always gave when she was about to say something she didn't want to say. His brother-in-law, Muckas, didn't answer. It was 7 in the morning and Muckas had a daughter to get ready for school, a life to hold together with shaking hands, and Daniel understood that, he did, but he also couldn't wait. He drove across town instead, still in yesterday's clothes, and stood on the porch of the house Cla and Muckas had bought 4 years earlier, a small blue Cape Cod with a wraparound garden Cla had spent 2 summers building from nothing. Muckas opened the door looking like a man who hadn't slept since the funeral, because he hadn't. His eyes were rimmed red, his jaw rough with several days of stubble, and when Daniel held out his phone and played the voicemail, Muckas's face did something Daniel had never seen a grown man's face do before. It folded. Not into tears exactly, but into something roca, something closer to disbelief mixed with a terror so old and so deep it seemed to come from somewhere beneath language. "That's not possible," Muckas whispered. "That's not possible, Danny." "I know." "Play it again." Daniel played it again, and again. By the 4th time, Muckas had sat down hard on the porch steps, elbows on his knees, staring at nothing. "She sounds scared," Muckas said finally. "Danny, she sounds scared." That was the detail that would haunt both of them for weeks to come, because it was true. There was something underneath Cla's words in that recording, some current of urgency that didn't match the voice they remembered from happier days. She sounded like a woman running out of time, and the terrible irony of that phrase was not lost on either of them. They took the phone to the Mulbertsk Police Department that same afternoon, and Detective Renata Faras, a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair, and the patient, unhurried manner of someone who had seen every kind of grief a small town could produce, listened to the recording twice with her brow furrowed in concentration. "I'm going to be honest with you both," she said, setting the phone down on her desk with the careful precision of someone handling evidence, though she hadn't yet decided if that's what it was. "My first instinct is that this is some kind of prank or a scam. There are ways to clone a person's voice now, using AI. It's gotten disturbingly good. People use old social media videos, voice memos, anything with a few minutes of clean audio, and they can generate almost anything." Claude didn't have a big social media presence, Daniel said. She hated being on camera. "There's still enough out there. Wedding videos, voicemail greetings. It doesn't take much anymore." Detective Faras rubbed at her temple. "But I want you to know I'm not dismissing this. The timing alone is worth looking into. I'm going to have our tech team trace the number the call came from, and I want you to send me everything, every text, every voicemail, any strange contact either of you has had since the funeral." "You think someone is doing this on purpose," Muckas said. It wasn't a question. "I think," Faras said carefully, "that your wife's death was ruled an accident very quickly, and there are still things about that night that never sat right with me." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, and for the first time since the funeral, Daniel felt something shift beneath the grief, a cold thread of suspicion beginning to unspool. The accident, as it had been recorded in the official report, was simple enough on paper. Claire had been driving home from her sister-in-law's baby shower in the neighboring town of Ashfield, alone, around 9 in the evening, when her car had left the road on a curve just past the old grain silo on Route 9, struck a guardrail, and rolled twice before coming to rest in the ditch below. She had not been wearing a seatbelt, which the report noted with a kind of clinical detachment that had made Daniel's stomach turn when he first read it, because Claire always wore her seatbelt, had worn it religiously since she was 16 years old, and had watched a classmate go through a windshield on that same stretch of road. Rain had been falling for most of the evening. The road had been slick. The county's conclusion had been that she'd taken the curve too fast, lost control, and the outcome had been tragic but unremarkable, one more entry in the long ledger of American roads claiming American lives. Nobody had questioned it at the time. Grief doesn't leave much room for scrutiny. But now, sitting in Detective Ferris's office with an impossible voicemail glowing on a phone screen between them, Daniel found himself asking the question he hadn't let himself ask before. What if it wasn't an accident at all? Over the following days, the investigation moved with the strange, lurching rhythm of small-town law enforcement, suddenly handed something far bigger than it was built for. The number that had called Daniel's phone traced back to a prepaid burner, purchased with cash at a gas station 40 minutes outside Millbrook, the kind of phone that left almost no trail once it was activated. The clerk at the gas station, a college kid working the overnight shift, remembered almost nothing useful, just that a man in a baseball cap had paid in cash and hadn't said much. The security footage, it turned out, had been overwritten before anyone thought to request it. Whoever had bought that phone had understood exactly how thin these small-town systems stretched and had planned around it. Detective Ferris brought in an audio forensics specialist from the state crime lab, a soft-spoken man named Elias Whitfield, who spent 2 days analyzing the 11-second recording with a patience that bordered on reverence. When he finally called Daniel and Marcus in to share his findings, he laid the results out on the table with the careful neutrality of a man who dealt in facts rather than feelings, though even he couldn't quite keep the unease out of his voice. "This isn't synthetic," Whitfield said. "I want to be very clear about that. I ran it through every detection model we have. Breath patterns, micro-tremors in the vocal cords, the kind of imperfections that AI voice cloning still struggles to fully replicate. This is a real human voice, not generated, recorded." "So it's really her," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. It's really her voice, Whitfield corrected gently. But that doesn't necessarily mean it was recorded recently. There are markers in the audio, subtle ones, that suggest to me this was pulled from an existing recording and edited. The background noise cuts in and out in ways that are consistent with splicing. Somebody took existing audio of her voice, saying real things she actually said at some point, and rearranged it, or paired a genuine clip with a new one. The room went very quiet. "You're saying someone recorded her," Marcus said slowly, without her knowing, and then used it. "I'm saying it's possible. I can't tell you when the underlying audio was recorded. It could be old. It could be recent. It could be from that very night, for all I know. The technology to determine exact age of an audio clip isn't as precise as television makes it seem." Whitfield hesitated, glancing between the two men. "But I will tell you this. Whoever did this had access to a substantial amount of clean audio of Claire's voice. That's not something you get from a public Facebook video. That's something you get from being close to her, recording her directly, in person, probably more than once." Daniel felt the floor tilt beneath him. Someone close to her. Someone who had stood near his sister, listened to her talk, recorded her voice for some purpose she never knew about, and then, after her death, used that voice like a key to unlock a door that should have stayed shut forever. The days that followed became a slow unraveling of Claire's final months, a period of her life that Daniel realized, with a guilt that sat heavy in his chest, he actually knew very little about. He and Claire had always been close, but close in the way siblings often are once they've built separate adult lives. Warm phone calls twice a week, holidays together, but not the daily intimacy of childhood. There were entire rooms of her recent life he had simply never walked into. Marcus, going through Claire's things with Detective Ferris present, found a locked drawer in her home office that he hadn't known existed, hidden beneath a false bottom in an old filing cabinet Claire had inherited from their grandmother. Inside was a small spiral notebook, half filled with handwriting that grew increasingly cramped and urgent toward the final pages, dated entries that told a story none of them had known was unfolding right under their noses. Claire had been an accountant for a mid-sized logistics company called Harrow Freight Solutions, based out of an industrial park on the edge of Ashfield. She had worked there for 6 years, quietly competent, well-liked, the kind of employee who never made waves. But according to the notebook, sometime in the spring of that year, she had discovered discrepancies in the company's shipping manifests, small at first, numbers that didn't quite add up between what was logged and what was actually moving through the warehouse. She had assumed it was a clerical error until she dug deeper, cross-referencing invoices against delivery records, and found a pattern that chilled her. Certain shipments, always routed through the same handful of drivers, always scheduled for late-night pickups, were being logged as containing industrial equipment parts, but the weights and dimensions in the manifest didn't match anything that could plausibly be industrial equipment. She had written, in an entry dated 6 weeks before her death, 3 words underlined twice: "This isn't parts." Over subsequent pages, her suspicion sharpened into something closer to certainty. She believed Harrow Freight was being used as a cover for something else entirely, something moving through Vermont under the cover of legitimate commercial trucking, something she didn't have proof of yet, but was terrified to name even in the privacy of her own locked notebook. She had started photographing manifests on her personal phone. She had begun quietly pulling her own copies of records before her supervisor could correct them, a word she used in the notebook with visible sarcasm and fear. And in her final entry, dated just 3 days before the crash that killed her, she had written something that made Detective Ferris go very still when she read it aloud. "I think someone knows I've been looking. Mr. Voss asked me today if I'd been staying late in the office. I said no. He didn't believe me. I need to talk to someone about this soon, but I don't know who I can trust. If anything happens to me, tell Danny to check the blue folder." There was no blue folder in the drawer. There was no blue folder anywhere in the house, not in the office, not in the garage, not in the trunk of the car that had been towed away weeks earlier as a total loss. Someone, it seemed, had already found it first. Detective Ferris's expression, when she finished reading, had hardened into something Daniel hadn't seen from her before. A kind of focused, contained fury that told him she was no longer treating this as a strange anomaly, but as an active homicide investigation. "Mr. Voss," she said. "That's Reginald Voss. He's the operations director at Harrow Freight. I know him. Went to high school with his younger brother." She closed the notebook carefully, as if it might crumble. "We're going to need a warrant for the company's full shipping records for the last year, and I want everything on the drivers Claire mentioned by name in here." The following 2 weeks moved with a strange, dreamlike intensity, the kind Daniel would later describe as feeling like he was watching his own life from just outside his body. Warrants were filed, and after some resistance from a company lawyer who arrived from Burlington within hours of being contacted, eventually granted. State police became involved once the word trafficking began to circulate quietly among investigators, a word nobody said aloud around Marcus or Daniel at first, though they both understood what it implied long before anyone confirmed it. The shipments Claire had flagged, once properly investigated, turned out to contain something far more dangerous than misrepresented industrial parts. Fentanyl, pressed into pill form and packed inside hollowed machine casings, moving from a port in New Jersey up through New England along a route that used small, unremarkable freight companies precisely because nobody expected to look twice at them. Reginald Voss was arrested on a Tuesday morning, taken from the Harrow Freight offices in handcuffs, while his employees watched from the parking lot, phones raised, the whole scene captured and uploaded within the hour to a dozen local social media pages. He was not, as it turned out, the architect of the operation, but a mid-level participant who had been recruited 2 years earlier through gambling debts he could never quite climb out from under. Under pressure from state investigators and facing decades in federal prison, Voss began talking within days, and what he revealed cracked the case open in a direction none of them had fully anticipated. He hadn't killed Claire. He swore that, repeatedly, with the particular desperate sincerity of a man trying to distance himself from the worst of what he'd been part of. But he had told someone that Claire was asking questions. He had panicked when she started pulling records, and in a moment of self-preserving cowardice he would later describe with visible shame, he had mentioned it to a man named Curtis Rail, one of the drivers Claire had specifically named in her notebook, a man with a record for assault going back over a decade, and a far more direct connection to the supply chain than Voss had ever wanted to know about. It was Curtis Rail who had followed Claire's car that night on Route 9. It was Curtis Rail, according to cell tower data eventually pulled by state investigators, whose phone had pinged off a tower less than a mile from the crash site at the exact time the accident occurred. And it was, investigators would ultimately determine, Curtis Rail's own truck, fitted with a push bar designed for off-road use, that had likely made contact with the rear corner of Claire's vehicle at high speed on that curve, sending her into a spin she never had a chance of correcting on the rain-slicked asphalt, before he continued past without stopping, letting the physics of the crash and the weather that night do the rest of the work of making it look like exactly what everyone had assumed it to be. The voicemail, it turned out, had nothing to do with Curtis Rail at all. That mystery unraveled separately, and in a way that broke Daniel's heart in an entirely different manner than the murder investigation had. Claire, terrified in the weeks before her death and increasingly convinced that something bad might happen to her, had begun quietly documenting things, not just in the notebook but in audio form as well. She had used a small digital voice recorder, the kind meant for interviews or lectures, to record several private messages meant to explain everything to Daniel if anything ever happened to her, a kind of insurance policy in her own voice, in case the written notebook was ever found and destroyed before he could see it. She had given the recorder, along with a spare key to a safety deposit box, to the one person outside her immediate family that she trusted completely. Her college roommate, a woman named Priya Chandrasekaran, now living 2 states away in Providence, Rhode Island. Priya had been devastated by Claire's death, so devastated that she hadn't been able to bring herself to open the small package Claire had mailed her 3 weeks before the accident, a package that had arrived with a note simply saying, "Keep this safe. I'll explain soon." It had sat unopened on Priya's dresser for over a week after the funeral, until grief and guilt finally pushed her to open it, and she found inside the digital recorder, a spare phone charged just enough to power on, and instructions, handwritten in Claire's looping cursive, that if anything ever happened to her, Priya should call Daniel from that phone and play him the recordings, one at a time, because Claire hadn't trusted email, hadn't trusted texts. Had wanted her brother to hear her actual voice, explaining what was happening, rather than reading it cold on a page. Priya, shaking and crying on the other end of the line when Detective Ferris finally tracked her down through Claire's old college records, explained that she had been too afraid and too grief-stricken to follow the instructions properly at first. She had listened to the first recording alone, breaking down completely, and hadn't been able to bring herself to call Daniel that same week. When she'd finally worked up the courage 4 days later, in the middle of the night because she genuinely could not sleep, she had used the burner-style prepaid phone Claire had specifically included in the package, exactly as instructed, purchased anonymously so that if anyone dangerous ever traced the call, it wouldn't lead back to a person who could be hurt. Claire, terrified and thinking clearly even in her fear, had built a chain of protection around her own warning from beyond the grave, not realizing how literally that phrase would come to apply. There were, it turned out, 6 more recordings on that device, and Daniel listened to every one of them in Detective Ferris's office over the course of a single, devastating afternoon, Marcus beside him gripping his hand so tightly it left marks. Claire's voice moved through those recordings with an arc that broke something open in Daniel's chest, starting almost matter-of-fact, explaining the discrepancies she'd found with the same patient clarity she'd always used to explain complicated things, and slowly, recording by recording, giving way to something more frightened, more urgent, until the final one, recorded just 2 nights before her death. When her voice trembled in a way Daniel had never once heard from his sister in 31 years of knowing her. "Danny, if you're hearing this, it means I was right to be scared, and I am so sorry that means I'm not there to tell you all this myself. I need you to promise me something. Don't let this disappear quietly. Don't let them make it look like nothing happened. Whatever they did to me, make sure the truth outlasts it. Tell Mia," her voice caught on her daughter's name, "tell Mia that her mom loved her more than anything in this world, and that everything I did, even the scary parts, I did because I wanted her to grow up in a world where people like me don't stay quiet just because it's dangerous to speak. I love you, Danny. I've always been so proud to be your sister. Please don't let this be for nothing." The recording ended, and for a long moment nobody in that room said a single word. Curtis Rail was arrested 9 days later, apprehended at a motel outside Manchester, New Hampshire, where he had been hiding out under a false name after learning, through a contact still working inside the now collapsing operation, that investigators were closing in. He confessed within 72 hours of his arrest, worn down by the weight of evidence that state investigators had assembled around him, cell data, the damaged push bar on his truck, which forensic examiners matched to paint transfer found on the wreckage of Claire's vehicle, and Voss's cooperating testimony. He was charged with second-degree murder, along with a long list of federal trafficking charges that would very likely keep him in prison for the remainder of his natural life. The trial, when it finally came 9 months later, was covered by local news stations across Vermont and briefly picked up by national outlets under headlines that used words like haunting and beyond the grave, framing the entire case as a kind of ghost story, which frustrated Daniel more than he expected it to. It wasn't a ghost story. It was the story of a woman who had understood she was in danger and had refused to let that danger silence her, who had built, with trembling hands and a borrowed phone and a college roommate she trusted with her life, a mechanism to make sure the truth outlived her even if she didn't survive to tell it herself. Daniel stood outside the county courthouse on the day the verdict came down, guilty on all counts, and looked up at a gray Vermont sky that seemed, for just a moment, to soften at the edges. Mia, 7 years old now, stood beside him holding Marcus's hand, too young to fully understand what justice meant, but old enough to know that something important had happened, something that would let her someday understand exactly who her mother had been. That night, alone in his apartment, Daniel sat with his phone in his hand and scrolled back to that first voicemail, the 11-second recording that had started everything, The one that had arrived 4 days after his sister's funeral and torn open a mystery no one had known existed. He had saved it, would always save it, would probably play it again on hard nights for years to come, not because it frightened him anymore, but because it no longer felt like a message from beyond the grave. It felt like exactly what it had always been. A sister protecting her brother, even from the very edge of everything, refusing to let silence be the last word. "Danny, it's me. I need you to listen carefully, okay?" He had listened, and in the end, so had the whole world.